equipped armies that Europe, Russia, and China are capable of deploying. It's a super sophisticated killing machine, deploying technologies and equipment unheard of in the armies of Europe, Russia, and China. Dr. Chalmers Johnson of UCLA reports, quote, "It's not easy to assess the size or exact the value of our empire of bases. Official records on these subjects are misleading, although instructive. According to the Defense Department's annual base structure report for fiscal year 2003, which itemizes foreign and domestic U.S. military real estate, the Pentagon currently owns 702 overseas bases in about 130 countries and has another 6,000 bases in the United States and its territories." Johnson continues, "Once upon a time, you could trace the spread of imperialism by counting up colonies. America's version of the colony is the military base. By following the changing politics of global basing, one can learn much about our ever larger imperial stance and the militarism that grows with it. Militarism and imperialism are Siamese twins joined at the hip. Each thrives off the other. But while this base system is a wonder to behold in its breadth and sophistication, one must bear in mind that it exists solely to impose a brutal system of misery and sorrow on those over which it stands guard. It is not a system of democracy, but one of brutality and tyranny. In a very real way, this system works more as a system of intimidation than it does of actual warfare. When everything is working properly, this system operates as a strategic backup to the indigenous militaries of America's slave states. It's these forces, that is to say the indigenous forces, that do most of the fighting and dying in support of the American New World Order system. The first line of defense in America's system are the militarized local police forces of America's slave states. These forces do not necessarily exist to serve the public over which they have been given charge, as they do to keep that public in line. Backing up these local police forces is the national police apparatus of the slave state under the control of the country's Interior Ministry and the Interior Ministry's paramilitary forces, that is to say, the death squads. Behind the national police forces of the Interior Ministry stands the National Army, backed up occasionally by American Special Forces, that is to say, Delta Force, the SEALs, and so forth. Finally, the American military itself stands at the ready behind all these forces to intervene whenever necessary to quash the occasional uprising that may get too far out of hand. These forces are located at the ready in America's base system and offshore on America's carrier battle groups. Finally, there is the matter of America's overwhelming nuclear superiority. And make no mistake about it, America stands absolutely supreme in this area. Indeed, the extent to which America dominates the world from a nuclear standpoint was made plain recently in an article that appeared in the March-April 2006 edition of Foreign Affairs, a CFR publication, entitled "The Rise of Nuclear Primacy" by Keir Lieber of the University of Notre Dame and Darrell Press of the University of Pennsylvania. Lieber and Press write that it is now possible for the United States to, quote, "destroy the long-range nuclear arsenals of both Russia and China with a first strike," unquote. Moreover, they indicate that the U.S. can now do it without fear that they would suffer a retaliatory strike. The ability to destroy all of an adversary's nuclear forces, eliminating the possibility of a retaliatory strike, is known as a first strike capability or nuclear primacy. To determine how much the nuclear balance between Russia and the United States has shifted since the end of the Cold War, Lieber and Press ran a computer model of a hypothetical U.S. attack on Russia's nuclear arsenal using the standard formulas that defense analysts have used for decades. They assigned U.S. nuclear warheads to Russian targets on the basis of two criteria. The most accurate weapons were aimed at the hardest targets, and the fastest arriving weapons at the Russian forces that can react most quickly. Because Russia is essentially blind to submarine attack from the Pacific Ocean and would have great difficulty detecting the approach of low-flying stealth nuclear-armed cruise missiles, they targeted each Russian weapon system with at least one submarine-based warhead or cruise missile. An attack organized in this manner would give Russian leaders virtually no warning. According to the simulation, every single Russian bomber base, submarine, and ICBM would be destroyed with no chance of a Russian counterstrike. Lieber and Press continue. This finding is not based on best-case assumptions or an unrealistic scenario in which U.S. missiles perform perfectly and the warheads hit their targets without fail. Rather, we used standard assumptions to estimate the likely inaccuracy and unreliability of U.S. weapon systems. Moreover, our model indicates that all of Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal would still be destroyed even if U.S. weapons were 20% less accurate than we assumed, or if U.S. weapons were only 70% reliable, or if Russian ICBM silos were 50% harder or more reinforced, and hence more resistant to attack than we had expected. Concerning China, Lieber and Press write, China's nuclear arsenal is even more vulnerable to a U.S. attack. A U.S. first strike could succeed whether it was launched as a surprise first strike or in the midst of a crisis during a Chinese alert. Now think about the implications of all this. The United States, if it so chose, possesses the power today to conduct a first strike against the nuclear arsenal of all its enemies, not only Russia and China, but the European community, France and Great Britain, and all the other remaining nuclear powers of the world, without fear of suffering a retaliatory strike. That's the truth of the matter. And one must remember here, in this world, as Mao has suggested, power flows out of the barrel of a gun. And anyone who thinks otherwise is a fool. Moreover, if the United States so chose, it could limit its first strike attack only to the targeted country's nuclear arsenals, sparing the cities, but reducing the populations of these countries to impotence in a single instant, and reducing their populations to slave status in the service of America's New World Order system. The clear implication being that if the population of these countries refused to submit to their new status, their cities would be incinerated. In this context, one should bear in mind that even after destroying the nuclear arsenals of all of its competitors, the United States would still possess thousands and thousands of additional nuclear-tipped missiles which could be utilized to carry out such a slaughter. So now we begin at last to understand the Apostles' lament concerning this beast nation. Quote, Who is like unto this